Oh, we're now live.
Okay, great. Welcome everybody in the room and everybody online. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the Sussex Development Lecture. My name is Mike Collyer. I'm in the Geography Department in the School of Global Studies. And it's a great pleasure to welcome my colleague in the School of Global Studies, Evan Killick. Evan is reader in anthropology and international development and has been working in Peru for the last 20 years or so and got back from Peru on Sunday. So despite jet lag, well, actually jet lag might be working in your favor at the moment.
Yeah,
but has come along to talk about a paper that draws significantly on his current ESRC project. He's PI on an ESRC project called Landscapes of Conservation. But his talk today is going to set that in context of this much longer engagement with this particular part of Peru. And it's called Sustained Destruction. I'll let you see the subtitle on the PowerPoint. Evan, thanks very much indeed.
Okay, thank you for coming. Now there's people online. I'm never very good with a microphone, so hopefully I'll modulate my voice. Okay, yeah, so as Mike said, I'm an anthropologist. And I've worked in Peru. I first went to Peru in 1999, which feels like a long time ago now, and did my PhD work there, which I'll come back to. So working in this region of Peru, but since then I've also done work. I did some work in Santarém in Brazil on soybean agriculture, did some stuff on red in Bolivia. I've also last year went with some colleagues from life sciences to Ecuador to work on looking at bats and then forms of conservation in Ecuador. So I've kind of had a range. With my current work, I try to do more kind of collaborative decolonizing stuff. So working with various partners, including a kind of indigenous university in Peru to teach students kind of filming techniques and different research techniques so that they can become partners in the research. The Landscapes of Conservation project I have does this, what's called Plan de Vida plans, where we work with the communities to map out their futures and what they want. So I kind of bring that in. This talk today is basically my own observations building on kind of 20 years of working in Peru, and specifically going back to my original field site, which is on the Ucayali River. So here we have Peru, and you've got the coast and the Sierra, the mountains, and then you've got the jungle on actually the kind of largest part of Peru, although it's kind of the least known in Peru and kind of internationally. But anyway, you've got Pucallpa, which is now turned into quite a big city in the jungle. And the big thing about that, it's got a road connection to it. And that's the district capital for what's here. The Ucayali here is it's the capital of the district. And where I work, so if you look at Pucallpa, and then the district I work in is called Iparia, and I'll talk about Iparia, the kind of town, but it's also the district. And this is the Ucayali River here, and this is the Pachitea River. And in between is the El Sira, which is a mountain range between the two rivers. And I first went to this area, well, I first went to the area in 1999, but my original field work started in 2001 and lasted around 2 years. And focused on two communities. So in Peru, they're called comunidades nativas, so native communities. That's like an official term. They're officially recognized as indigenous communities. And the two communities have Ashaninga people, and there's a whole other story about the fact that there's Ashaninga and Ashaninga. When I first got there, we just called them Ashaninga people, but there's been a slight separation of them, and there's a complicatedness there, which I've been involved in, but I'm not going to talk about today. But I will continue to use Ashaninga. So the two communities I worked in one is called La Selva, which is the most imaginative name for a city in the town in the jungle, because La Selva means the jungle. So that's one community, and the other community is called Pifwayal, which is named after the Pifwayos, which is a palm fruit that's there. So both of them are Shaninga communities with some incoming kind of mestizos from Pucallpa and the area, but native communities. Yeah, and you can see here the El Sierra, which is behind the two, behind both communities. There, that's seeing it from the river coming up around here somewhere. And so when I first got there in 2001, El Sierra was designated as a reserva communal, a communal reserve. And at the time, I didn't even know that was happening, and none of the communities I was in really knew about it or talked about it. So that reserva communal has now been there for over 20 years. And when I went back, so I've kind of been back regularly, and for the last 10 years or so, the reserva has been more obvious and been more known and kind of talked about locally. But when I went back a couple of years ago, again, I was in Peru for my project, which is in a different area, but I went, used that as an excuse to go back to these communities. And I suddenly was kind of struck by the dramatic changes that had happened to the landscape. And then thinking about that in relation to the fact that this was a reserva communal. And the key kind of obvious things were where houses, so this is a Shaninga house, you traditionally have a chacra around it, like a garden, where you plant manioc, the cassava, which is the main crop, but then a mix of different things. So it's classic Sweden agriculture with a mix of all different things. And now there's still some of that exists. But suddenly, many more people had this, which was big kind of pasture lands where they'd felled the forest completely. They'd felled the chacra and they'd just put in grass for cattle. And then the other big thing was that this path that I used to walk down from La Selva down to the main river, so there's a Shipibo community called Amacaria. So this path had suddenly turned into that. So you suddenly had a kind of much more permanent, a bigger, from a path to a road, getting more permanent, and then the cattle alongside it. And so that was kind of striking. And again, what was interesting, I'd seen it happen bit by bit, and then suddenly, with this road was suddenly passable, and I was there in the summer, and some people had brought motocars, which are like the tricycle kind of, like tuk-tuk kind of things. And suddenly you could drive along this for like an hour or so, and there was just this cattle ranching everywhere. And so it was just really striking about this change that had happened over the 20 years. And then last year, a friend of mine, Pedro Saldaña, who I'll talk about, had been the mayor of Iparia, and it was elections last year. And one of his main things that he talked about to be re-elected as mayor was about officially making that road into a road and getting it recognized by the state, and so that the state would support it. And the key thing about that road is, so here, this is where I'm talking about, this is where the communities are, and that was the bit of road I showed you, some of it. But that road goes all the way through the communal reserve and across to a place called Torna Vista, which is on the Pachitea, and you cross over there, and then it connects into the main Peruvian road network and through to Pucallpa. So suddenly realizing that this road is being built, they want to make it permanent, they want to make it official, and it's going through the reserve. So again, essentially, standing back from that, that just looks like a failure. That looks like, how can the whole point of communal reserves is to try and protect the forest and to protect this area, and it hasn't worked. And so basically that's what I'm going to talk about today, is trying to think about how and why that's happened. And I'm going to, I think, and if we think it is a bad thing, we have to think about, why it's been allowed. And then we have to think about ways forward. So what I'm going to do is go through why the road happened. I'm then going to make a key argument is around its relationship to sustainable development and how basically within the sustainable development paradigm that justifies the investment in the road. Then I'm going to talk about cattle and similarly kind of look at why people want it and how it relates to broader ideas of development. And then think about timber, which goes back to my original work. And then I'll think about ways forward. Yes, and again, I'll try and, so I've just come back. And again, originally I was meant to give this paper like 2 months ago or something. And then who knows what has happened, COVID and strikes and all the rest of it. So I've been building it, but then I've been adding in stuff while I was just there last week. Okay, yeah, so just to go back to the communal reserve to explain that. So it started in 2001, and the communal reserve, the Reserva Comunal, under Peruvian law, is a very progressive kind of interesting and important step. And the key idea of a Reserva Comunal, so different from a national park or other forms of protected area in Peru, the key idea of a Reserva Comunal is that it's co-managed. So you have SNAMP, which is the National Forest Protection Service, and they have a team who are assigned to this case El Sira. There's like a jefe, and there's a team of about 5, and then they have around another 7 park guards. And then you also have what's known as an ECA, so the ECA, which is so officially the ECA is the executor of the administrative contract. So essentially what happens when they set up the Reserva Comunal, they agree that it's going to be administrated by this non-governmental body, this non-governmental group, who are meant to represent and be selected from the native communities around the reserve. And in the official way, officially, it's a co-management scheme. So there's meant to be equal kind of rights between, or indeed, the indigenous, the ECA, is actually meant to control the reserve, and SNAMP are meant to be the kind of support team, the kind of official people. Yeah, and the key things that the ECA is meant to do is to come up with plan de manejo, so management plans that go over kind of 10 years, and then also POA's individual annual plans about the use of resources, what's going to be done in the area. And again, it's that the center, so the green here is the reserve, that is fully protected and is meant to be completely not completely off limits to communal people. We'll talk about that, but that's the kind of key reserved areas. And then you have the communities that are all around it that are within a part of the communal reserve, but their land, they're freer to do what they want with their lands. Anyway, so that's the kind of core setup of how it's meant to be managed and done. Okay, yeah, and so the ECA is called EcoSIRA, is the group that are meant of people from the native communities that manage that are meant to manage the park. Okay, so then again, we've got this Reserva Comunal, and this is where this road is going through. And so my question is, why is a road being allowed, and kind of what are the dynamics around the road being built there? And again, what's interesting is, and now being able to be on social media, so I still get to go to Peru and interview people and do my kind of ethnographic research, but I also get to follow everyone on Facebook and WhatsApp and all the rest of it. And so again, what's been interesting last year, again with Pedro Saldana, part of his mayoral campaign, but also in a broader way within local people, was this push for this road. And basically you see here, Ruta Paria, with hearts and then people, so again, the transport was starting to bring in grading machines, laying gravel in certain places, and there were people on social media taking videos of it and sending it, going, look, isn't this amazing? We've got this road, this is so great. And again, as I was saying, so this is Pedro Saldana, and on his Facebook specifically was lots of pictures of all the kind of modernizing he's doing for Iparia. He'd been mayor from 2015 to 2018. In the Peruvian system, you can only stand for one thing at a time, so then he had to stand down, and then he's just been re-elected. So the elections were last year, and he came back into post in 2023. And so this is the town of Iparia, where he's mayor. And again, from as soon as literally kind of 1st of January, when he took office again, he was out, and this is all from social media as well, saying we're grading it, we're doing all these things, and it was this kind of big push for having the road. And he got engineers from the Ministry of Transport to come and whatever engineers do, lay out work out. There is a route, and just whatever they do. They use those theodolites and they do stuff, don't they? Or I guess they don't use theodolites anymore, they use GPS. But anyway, basically officially making the route so that it would be onto the, it would be officially recognized by the state as a road. And they produced this report basically arguing that this was needed and that the Regional Transportation Commission was going to officially recognize it as a road. So that was Thursday, January the 12th. Yeah, and then I can't remember, it's like IC 123 or something. It gets an official official designation. So again, as an anthropologist, part of you is thinking, okay, what is it about roads and what's going on with roads? And here I draw on the work of Penny Harvey and Hannah Knox. So they did some work, had a project a few years ago up in the Andes, looking at roads there. And I'm just going to read a piece because it kind of brilliantly sums up the feeling about roads in rural Peru. So they write, in Peru, as in many developing countries, roads have meanings that go well beyond their physical functionality. Banks and governments view them favorably as technologies of social integration, economic development, and modernization. They are also relatively easy to sell to the wider public in places where poor communication systems exacerbate the physical and economic hardships of everyday life. Indeed, many Peruvians long for roads with a fervor that we found hard to fathom at first, given some of the more terrible effects that roads are often held responsible for in more critical accounts. That said, it must be stated from the outset that people are not wrong in their understandings of the correlations between the presence of a road and the possibilities for economic growth, that these smooth connective services afford a networked flow of goods, labor, and services. They deliver the basic conditions of modern living, although, as all scholars of modernity are aware, the benefits are uneven and unpredictable. So again, I just think that's a kind of perfect summing up of this relationship to roads. And, so the first thing is they're amazing. That traveling by river just takes that much longer. You have to have boats and, it's harder, ferries and that kind of thing are much harder to work than a bus, which can just kind of stop wherever and pick people up. There's all these kind of practical reasons why. You can also talk about David Harvey's idea of the kind of compression of time and space and just see it as a technology of modernity. So there's all of that, and we can think about that. I mean, again, what was just striking was, again, on Facebook, half my fieldwork's now on Facebook, there's this group called the Moto Club Charapas. Charapas is turtles, but it's a name that Pucalpinos call themselves, people from the jungle call themselves. And they drive around on these kind of half-done roads. And as one of them said, imagine being a kid seeing a motorbike arriving for the very first time in your village. They kind of see themselves as these kind of explorers, as these pushers of modernity, bringing modernity to these villages. So again, it's just thinking about the imaginary of the road and the power of the road and the practical power of the road. So that's part of what's driving this. So again, that's not entirely surprising. What I think is surprising, and again, what I think deserves unpacking more, is the fact that CERNAMP and the management team of El Cira are also fully supportive of the road. Yeah, and so this was the official laying of, so that was last year, it's the official laying of a first stone of the road. And there were this is the CERNAMP head of El Cira and other members of the team. And so there it is. So it's road UC 115. So the official recognition of road UC 115. And they write, the Park Co-Management Committee continues to work for the benefit of native communities that are members of EcoCira and the local population in fulfilling its functions. Together, we are the El Cira Communal Reserve. And that was written specifically on that photo saying we're supporting this road. And so that's interesting. Yeah, and that seems striking, yeah? And so then what I want to think about is what that tells us about sustainable development and this idea, and my argument is that the bringing together under sustainable development of economic, social, and environmental sustainability means that is precisely the argument that Elsira uses for the road, and then, as I'll argue, also for cattle and for timber. And so it's trying to kind of unpack that and think about what's going on. And here I go, and again, I'm at IDS. We all know the SDGs, and I'm sure hopefully you've all learned about them and criticized them and thought about them in lots of different ways. And again, there's lots of different takes on it, but just as a simplistic kind of way of thinking about it, I just focus on the work of Jeffrey Sachs, who I think is a reasonable representation of the SDGs, or particularly one particular dominant view of the SDGs. And basically, this is from his book, The Age of Sustainable Development, and he argues that sustainable development is a normative outlook on the world. It recommends a set of goals to which the world should aspire. And the other key thing he says is, in this normative or ethical sense, sustainable development calls for a world in which economic progress is widespread, extreme poverty is eliminated, social trust is encouraged, and the environment is protected. Yeah? And I think my key point is that emphasis on those three things. Yeah? On economics, because this argument about poverty alleviation, this social trust, social sustainability, and then environmental sustainability. And within that take, as I understand it, there's that argument that the environmental cannot take precedence over the economic and the social. And I think within that broader logic, and again, we can discuss this, is an idea, the argument is that you need economic development, because if you don't have economic development, poor people are going to destroy the environment more. So you need to bring them out of poverty in order to protect the environment. And so that becomes the reason, the argument for bringing those three things together, that you can't just focus on the environment because you have to focus on poverty alleviation because those things are all interconnected. Yeah. And again, here I was Amber Huff and Lars Otternes in the IDS bulletin last year say note that dominant approaches to address climate and other processes of environmental change share a tendency to place growth, not ecology, nor climate, and certainly not justice, at the heart of the international policy agenda. So I found that, I was like, yep, that's what I think is going on as well, that emphasis on that. And again, if you look at the plan, the Maestro, the Reserva Communal, Elsira, they absolutely echo and use that structure of the SDGs. So they have a core moment where they talk about the three objectives of Elsira, and there's the environmental objective, there's also the economic objective, and there's also the social, cultural objective. Yeah, so they've totally taken on board that framing of the SDGs, of the sustainable development in general, and written that into the Plan de Maestro. The Plan Maestro, the Elsira master plan. Okay, and again, so my argument is that that is precisely what justifies the creation of this road. And here, and again, I want to kind of have that debate and think about it. But in the Jeffrey Sachs version of this, the SDGs are precisely meant to be synergies, that you're meant to be able to solve environmental issues with economic, with social, that they're all intermingled and you need to be doing that. And I don't disagree with that. And indeed, Joe is sitting right here. All the important work here at Sussex with the SSRP is precisely, some of us, looking for those synergies, and we need to be looking for those synergies and making ways in which that can work. My question here is specifically, are there cases where we shouldn't be doing that, where the environmental should take precedence over the other? Are there dangers in which some people will take the fact that we are emphasizing the economic, the social, and the environmental to lessen our engagement with the environmental? Yeah, and that there's an idea that longer term goal of, that we deal with the economics and then the environment will follow. And my argument, based on what I'm observing in Peru in this specific space, is there's a danger in doing that we have this environmental destruction. And so while it's really important to think about synergies where there might also be moments where we don't think about that, and we assess the levels of what's going on. Okay, so then my second thing, so I've thought about the road and the fact that El Sierra is protecting the road. So now I want to look at cattle and think in a similar way, why is everyone supporting cattle? So the first thing is to go back to my original research, working with the indigenous communities, indigenous people themselves. So again, when I was there in 2001, no one had any cattle. They were just having their chacras, basically for subsistence living. There was some selling of kind of meat and fish and, some kind of rice and some crops they could grow, but cattle wasn't a thing. It has slowly come into the area. And just when I was there now, I was asking people in more detail about cattle, and all of them basically say, we like cattle because it's less work and potentially it's more lucrative, because when you have a chakra, you basically have to fell it every year. You have to kind of fell a new one, you have to plant, you have to grow. Some of it you can sell, but like manioc doesn't get that higher price. But the idea is if you cut a pasture, it's a lot of work the first time you do it, but then actually it's less work to keep it up. And potentially, if you get lots of cows, you can make lots of money or more money. It's not loads, but some more money. And then also I think that, so there's two things. One is, so this is in Pif Wayal, at the top of Pif Wayal, and people have cut the pasture, but there's no cows. Because there's kind of a promise of cows. There's the idea, well, we can cut the pasture, let's do that. And then we'll save up money to buy the cows. So there's an element of kind of hoping for the future. But there's also a thing that when you get the cows, to make money on them, as we'll talk about, you have to then make it into a system where you're growing calves, and then they get to a certain size and you're killing them and you're making money, and there's a whole, whatever kind of capitalist process to it. For those people who do have cows, they don't tend to kill them. They just tend to keep them. And they say they're like, and this is a common thing across the world for poorer people with cattle, is that they're a savings bank. Yeah, is the classic thing that you've got it. And if something happens, if there's an emergency, normally, your child is ill, then you can kill it and sell the meat, or you can sell it to a neighbor or whatever. So again, the whole idea of it being lucrative isn't really there, in that some people don't even have them, and the people who do have them have very few and hold on to them because they don't want to sell them, because they're basically saving them for a rainy day. So that's part of what's going on. Another thing, and this is then reminded me of James Ferguson, so I went back to The Anthropolitics Machine, but also his original article, The Bovine Mystique. And in that, which hopefully you all know, but he specifically looked at a livestock intervention in Lesotho. And one of the key things was a similar observation about how people weren't willing to sell the cattle. Yeah, there was a particular idea, and again, of improving cattle and all the rest of it, but that people, what he called the bovine mystique, that idea that cattle were worth something separate from money, in a very anthropological way of thinking the value of the cow wasn't entirely monetary. Yeah, and that people in that case, it was to do with bride wealth and a longer tradition of cows and a whole aspect of that. In the Latin American case, it's different from Lesotho. There isn't that long history, but there is, I think, something interesting about the bovine mystique. Yeah, and again, here I'm just thinking about in the United States, that's very true. The cowboy, the whole myth of the cowboy and stuff. But again, across Latin America, and I know there's a few Peruvians in the room who can shout at me and stuff, but again, there is that similar tradition, and arguably, I talk about this to my undergrads in my Latin America thing, the cowboy, the archetypal United States man, the original cowboys were from Mexico, were indigenous, were mixed with people from the Iberian Peninsula, with African Americans as well. And part of that is that the whole riding style, where you have you don't have a bridle and bit, which is what you have in England. You have a rope around the muzzle. That's all from the Quintanera, from a Spanish riding style. So the classic thing is that the classic United States white man, is again a myth, is part of that myth. And my argument here is that idea of cowboys, gauchos as they're known in southern Brazil, is is in the Latin American culture as well. And they have their own versions of kind of country music and stuff. And I would argue that that has come into the kind of Peruvian consciousness in the jungle as well. And again, using social media, people talk, they show these pictures of themselves with their cattle, that there's a kind of machoism to it. There's an aspect of it, again, so this is one of the people in La Selva saying, I love these animals, and then trabajando, I'm working, and showing strong. So there's this whole kind of glamorization of having cattle as well. And this is a statue, this is Pedro Saldaña, the mayor, and this was from a few years ago. And he had this statue of himself with a cow made, or a bull rather, in Iparia. And so I took that picture of him a few years ago. And again, so my argument is that there's this kind of practical thing of why people want cattle, but also there's this mystique, there's this kind of power of them as well. And here, I'm just going to quickly mention an idea of what's called shifting baseline syndrome, which is that I would argue that the landscape itself of the forest is now, people like this idea of cattle. So they've kind of naturalized the idea of cattle ranching in the Amazon. So this is Comunidad Nativa La Selva. So this is, La Selva has its own Facebook page, of course it does now. And it says the landscapes of my jungle. And again, it's playing on the fact that La Selva is the name of the community and also the jungle. And again, and this is the charapas, the moto guys, the motorbike guys, and they take pictures of that. This is the daughter of a friend of mine, Adriana. She lives in Lima now. She grew up in Pucallpa, kind of middle class in Pucallpa. So when she comes back to Pucallpa, she takes her husband and kids out to a ranch and she says, this is the true jungle. Yeah. So it's just that argument that the very idea of what the jungle is, the jungle landscape, has become kind of catalyzed. Cattle has become part of it, part of the imaginary of what it is. Okay, yeah, I'm aware of time. So another aspect of cattle, so this is a receipt from Pedro Saldaña, the mayor, to Pifwayal, the community, selling his cows to the community, yeah? And so here there's a whole interesting stuff I can go into about thinking about political patronage, the fact that he sells the cows relatively cheaply, but also, there's political favors involved. There's all forms of patronage and exchange and reciprocity going on here, which again, I don't have time to go into, but is another aspect of what's going on with cattle here. And now, the other thing, to get back to my central argument, thinking about the narrative of sustainable development, is that also within certain parts of development conversations, there is support for cattle ranching. And so this is an IPCC report where it says, where it calls for better grazing and land management, improved nature, all of these aspects, and saying that, this is another part of development. We can improve the ways in which people have cattle. And this here is a leaflet that gets handed out around the area, produced by the WWF with that, you can't see, but it's the UK Pact, which is whatever that is, the UK Recovery Challenge Fund or whatever it is. So with UK money, with WWF, with all of that, calling for more efficient and sustainable farming, yeah? And again, and then this is from Ian Scoons, and I can't see who the other person is, sorry. But this is a report produced out of IDS. It was written up in one of the IDS bulletins recently, saying our livestock are always bad for the planet. And again, you can have that debate and you can think about the ways in which in certain areas livestock can be improved and is more natural in that environment, and the important reasons and why you should and can improve that, and how that can have synergies and all the rest of it. But my point here is that the dangers of that conversation happening elsewhere in very important contexts where it's relevant feeds back into these kind of areas, and you get this, so that when someone like me comes along and says, is cattle great? They went, well, look, there's this from the WWF saying that we should improve what we're doing and it's great and we should carry on. So again, it's just thinking about the ways that those narratives are coming back onto the ground in this particular case. So I'm not saying Ian Scoons and the rest of the team are wrong in thinking about, positive things about cattle in other places. I'm just saying here might not have worked entirely. It might be having unintended consequences in the places where cattle is being invasive. And again, my specific argument is that because there is that, you can find a broader narrative in support of cattle and saying we should be improving it, that allows for the increase in cattle. Yeah, and so more and more spaces being used for cattle. Because again, part of the argument of improving it is saying you can do it more intensively, and there's the argument that you wouldn't use as much land, yeah? But the unintended consequence is that people say, oh, they say we can do it better, and we've done it better here, now we're gonna do it better here, and we're gonna keep going, no? So that becomes part of the issue. And again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, underlying it is this logic of making it a business, of making it productive as possible, increasing productivity and all the rest of it, which I would argue for Indigenous people doesn't work because they have this idea, a kind of idea of just wanting cattle, but also of saving them. And so they're not doing that kind of productive way in the same way. So again, that kind of disconnection between it. And again, what I find interesting in another aspect of this is thinking about how in some of that writing up of it, there's an idea of cattle ranching as being kind of traditional. And again, because it's in the rural areas, and again, thinking about cowboys and all the rest of it, and the cow originally comes from Europe. The cow is not native to any part of the Americas. But again, there's that idea of the traditional fact of it. And so that then in supporting it, you're supporting kind of traditional forms of farming. And again, that's allowing it. And here, and I don't have time, I'm running out of time, but there's also a broader argument I want to make about how within the Plan de Manejo, within the whole kind of setting up of the Reserva Communal, is an idea of Indigenous people as kind of being inherently good with nature. So there's that kind of idea of we're going to let them do what they want with nature and they're going to be good with it. Whereas they might indeed cut down, have pastures, have cows, have all the rest of it. And so again, that's another thing to unpack. This draws on my older work, again, from my PhD and then the publications I've done since then, where I look at specifically Ashaninga involvement in the timber industry, and again, showing how and why they're involved in it in the same way I'm doing now with cattle and the road. And again, drawing out, there's a specific article in the Bulletin of Latin American Studies, drawing out the ideas of, so buen vivir, good living within Indigenous kind of thing, that gets married with environmentalism. And I just unpick that and suggest we need to be careful about aligning Indigenous people with Western forms of environmentalism, and that there can be synergies, there can be things working together, but also there can be differences. And particularly, you can't just take for granted that Indigenous people are going to protect the forest in the same way that Western environmentalists think about protecting the forest. Again, there's lots there. And so this was me, much younger looking, original work I used to do that I'm talking about with where the Ashaninka were involved in small scale logging in their lands, working with timbermen who would come from Pucallpa, and that's what happened. And the final kind of thing I want to say is, the final aspect of this is that, again, where you used to walk through and then you'd cut out, you'd fell just a few trunks somewhere, you'd take it out kind of by hand. Again, last year when I went back, we were walking up through the headwaters of the Amacaria River, which is the one, the quebrada, the stream that goes up through Pifuayal and then up to El Sira. It literally comes out of the ground in El Sira, and it's kind of pretty much untouched, and there's a few Ashaninga who live right up in the forests. And we were walking through there, and we suddenly came out, and there was this massive road, and it was a logging road. And so again, aware of time, from when I started fieldwork in 2001, and there was that small-scale timber extraction, the Peruvian government deliberately decided to crack down on that And the argument was that instead of small scale, you should have large timber companies, and that they would be granted big concessions, or they would do deals with the native communities. And the argument was that they're easier to control. They were able to, and they do these amazing things where they go in and they geo-reference every single tree, and then they cut it out and they have a record of it. And ideally that can then be connected all the way to when you buy timber here, you can see where it's from. So there's all those ideas about the power and control that comes from having large companies. But the flip side of that is that they go in and they make these huge roads and they take out huge amounts of timber in a single go. And so again, the contract that they had, that this company Cabrera has with PIF over the last 2 years, is that they're going to work 4 different areas, which is kind of probably about a third of the whole land, and they're going to give them 1 million soles officially. That's what the contract is for, more or less, so about £220,000. They won't get all of that money because the company will take off their expenses and all the rest of it. But again, here we can see how, again, there's the government move from small scale to clamping down that to large scale, and then we can see the incentives for the communities. But the other aspect of this is that that contract is supported by El Cira again, yeah? Because again, within the understandings of the economic objectives, again, the idea is to use non-timber products in these areas, but there's a kind of a get-out clause of saying that all natural resources can be used by the communities. So this contract is completely legal and is allowed. Yeah. So again, that's my final example of, so we've had the road, we've had cattle, and now we have timber that are all allowed, permitted within the system of the communal reserve. And within that broader thing. And then, not to depress us too much, but so that road, the timber road, goes from here, so it goes to San Juan de Nuya, which is another community here. And basically this company has made contracts with the communities along here and just carried on cutting this road. And they still take the timber back to here where they lay them on big tractors, on big barges, and then take them down to Pucallpa. But obviously, this was originally a timber road. This gets officialized. It's not hard to imagine that this is going to happen. And indeed, people in PIF have made petitions to Pedro Saldana and the authorities to make that road, to connect this road, which doesn't exist, which is just a timber road, through to Charara, which would then connect it to Iparia, which would connect it to Pucallpa. Yeah. So again, you can just see the slow creeping way in which before long, I won't have to fly from Pucallpa to Atalaya, which is down here, which is where my other project is. There'll be a road going the whole way. Yeah, and I've got 2 minutes. And then, as local people say, when you get that whole road, and there's still the idea that the timber is only being taken out from the comunidades nativas, which again is all legal. It doesn't come out of, we're still protecting the central reserve. But as is happening on the Pachitea, where there are roads, where there is better access, there's gold mining, there's illegal timber being taken out there, it's not hard to see in the future timber being taken out from the reserve itself. Once all the timber is taken out from the communities, that it will then come out of the reserve. And this was something, this is Senam's system, so basically protection system of possible alerts. And this, using GPS satellite data, flagging up. This is the reserve. There's actually a buffer zone, partly because they never did it all right. But anyway, but there's areas here where it looks like the timber company is taking some timber out of a kind of grey area. And indeed, last year, the reason I went up there was because I went with the park guards to go and look what was going on. Okay, so quickly to summarize. So basically my argument is that all of these things are justified by sustainable development, by that kind of narrative, that understanding, and the way that it's been put into the reserve, the communal reserve, the plans, and all the rest of it, and within the narratives for people, for local politicians, for all the rest of it. And I think that's a problem. is basically my take home. And again, this is specifically in this area, but I think it's a more general point that can be made. But my argument simplistically would be where at the moment we're meant to think about it like this. What we need to do is put the environment first, and then the social, and then the economic, and we need to think about that. And whether that's something that happens at a global scale, or whether we just say, okay, but that definitely needs to happen in these kind of environmentally important areas. That's my simple take home. Some other things is again going against the kind of poverty drives biodiversity loss. So this is a paper I've been by Rachel Commenter that I'm a co-author. It's one of those 20 people on it pages. But again, trying to make the argument that again, focusing on poverty alleviation as a driver of biodiversity is dangerous, and we need to get away from that. And fundamentally, there's that idea that if economic development is the most important thing for communities, if we decide that these communities are poor in those terms, then the only way we can decide they're not poor is if they have more money, and the only thing they have to give up is their natural resources. Yeah. So again, it's a kind of deeper argument which I need to develop more, but is just thinking about how the very idea of economic development means that you're going to have use of natural resources in these kind of places. Yeah, and then some other kind of key points, but also this is driven by outside demands, so that becomes part of the picture. Okay, and I'm already over time, but in a final few positive things, it's just thinking about stuff I try and do and try and engage with on the ground to maybe go forward. So one is trying to improve the co-management system, trying to bring in different voices, trying to make it work slightly better. I'm slightly skeptical, but we've had this project funded by the SSRP, and we're working with, so again, this is Fermin Chimantani, who's the head of ANACAP, which is the overall organization in charge of the ECAs, trying to work on that and trying to think through ways of making that stronger. Other things which maybe you can ask about is, so Peru has the Programa Bosque, which is payments for keeping the forest. The problem here is that they pay 10 soles per hectare. So Pifwayal, I've been told that they would get about 86,000 soles over a few years. But again, if you compare that with the 1 million soles from the timber company, it's difficult. Also, it would limit the people from cutting too many more chakras, and also they're only allowed to spend the money in particular ways. So so again, that needs to be evened up, the realities of that. Another thing would be going back to small scale timber and getting away from the large companies and trying to find sustainable timber use within the communities, because essentially that's been made illegal. It's just so hard to do. You need so many forms and all the rest of it to do it. So the one thing would be to support that instead and go back to an older form of artisanal logging. We could frame it as that. And then just my final point is thinking about indigenous modernity, that again, this goes back to my bigger arguments about indigenous people. We can't just assume that they're a particular kind of people and a particular kind of environmentalism and stuff. We have to engage with the realities, their complex realities at the moment. There are a few things of plantation and reforestation and stuff, but again, that needs much more support. And then finally, I think my big thing in all of this, the simplest thing, well, whatever, the most obvious thing is just education. So investing in supporting indigenous youths, young people getting degrees. So again, the work we've been doing with Napolki, which is this indigenous university in Atalaya, getting indigenous people, valorizing indigenous identities, fighting for indigenous rights, and then thinking about environmentalism. But again, getting the students themselves to have those discussions, think about their futures, not from a purely kind of the view of their parents living in the communities, but also thinking about the broader, what we can learn from broader experiences elsewhere and opening up the education in that way. So again, I'm not very good at hope ever, but there are ways forward which don't have to be as terrible as that. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Evan. It's a vast amount of material, but
Yes. 20 years in 40 minutes, I think I did quite well.
But I think quite a clear argument in the stages that you presented it in. There's already quite a few questions from people online that I will start with. If anyone in the room has, thank you. I'll go round in that direction. Let's take one question from online first. Do you think their view of we'll never cut all the trees is a misguided view? We've seen for ourselves in the UK, pieces of land we said would never be built on have become housing estates, etc. Might it just take one greedy person or a handful to be placed in the wrong position within an organization to persuade others to utilize more and more land for financial gain? That's from Avery.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I had to skip over that slide. So that slide was taken 20 years ago, climbing up in El Sierra with some indigenous people, some friends, and me saying, you know, like timber, it's a bad thing and stuff. And then looking out over from El Sierra over Pifual, over the river, and, you know, as far as you can see, it's trees. And them saying, what are you talking about? We're never going to get rid of all this. And then my point is, absolutely, you can see this slow change. And again, so that's the thing of 20 years of going there and suddenly being like, no, you are going to get it. And I can see exactly how that's going to happen. And that's my point about education, which is, so again, talking to other people in other parts of Peru, where it has happened, and there's been massive deforestation, particularly along the road that comes from Lima to Pucallpa, and you've got oil palms and the rest of it, and all the people living there are like, this is terrible. So part of the education thing is to take people from there to these areas and say, you know, tell them what happened and and see how it's a bad thing. Again, then we have the broader issues of individual choices and what's being happened. But all you can do is bring in those conversations. So.
Thank you. Let's have a question from in the room. The one row back, and that's it. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. So I used to work in the development consultant in infrastructure sector. So my question is about mainly for the road. So my question is like maintain road and reinforce for natural disaster. It costs much expensive more than building the new road. So how in Peruvian context, how stakeholders think about like sustainable road infrastructure in finance? And other question is like, how these projects create job opportunities for local people?
So the way the road creates job opportunities. So yeah, job opportunities isn't really, I guess that is part of it. Yeah, I mean, I guess that feeds into it as well, because then there are some jobs. So I guess that becomes, I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, that becomes part of Pedro the Mayor's kind of calculus, that then it's jobs and you're bringing in these machines and then people are working and stuff. So yeah, I think that becomes part of it. I think the bigger, your other question of thinking about the trade-offs between how much it costs and then the environmental costs and all the rest of it. I mean, that's precisely what I'm arguing, which is that because there's that focus on economic growth, that kind of swamps everything else. And again, when we do the calculus, and this is the broader question, isn't it? Which is when we do the calculus of the economic cost of environmental damage, we're terrible at it. You know, like globally, we know that these are all bad things, you know, and we know that climate change is incredibly destructive, but getting the investment into saving stuff is incredibly hard, whereas getting the investment to carry on drilling for oil and doing things is not. So that just talks to, I think, a broader question, which is then where we go into no growth and degrowth and all those kind of questions, which I don't particularly want to get into. It becomes a philosophical discussion as well.
Hope that you mentioned.
Yes, I know. Which I mean, again, I feel always as the anthropologist, we can destroy anything, any kind of hope.
Thank you. Let's go to the front row.
Thank you so much for that. I'm actually curious about because you mentioned how there's an attitudinal positivity towards scaling up in terms of even if that feeds capitalist interests, how does the attitude towards animal agriculture and the larger sort of vegan movement of, minimizing optional dependence, right? In the sense that, basically what capitalism is doing is mass production of animal derived products, which are not optional in certain regions, like, say, for example, I don't know, the poles. So, what's the attitude towards scaling up animal agriculture from that, perspective?
What culture? Sorry.
Sorry?
Scaling up what culture?
Animal agriculture, like cattle,
Right.
essentially.
What's the thing of scaling it up? They want to scale it up. No, but sorry. So I understand that, so again, bringing in things like vegan and all that. So again, there's that argument, thinking about overconsumption, and that a lot of this is driven by consumption from outsiders.
Yeah.
So that is absolutely a thing we should think about.
Yeah.
But in the Peruvian context, it's still not so there's certain parts of Lima, which again, I was hanging out in on Saturday, where you can get your, oat skinny latte and vegan food, but in the region, in the Amazon, it's just not a thing. And again, I'm not vegetarian, but friends who go there and are vegetarian find it incredibly hard. So again, that's what's interesting is, and again, whether we then think about education and whether, you could show the benefits of that, but then that's kind of massive cultural change. So then I think that's a discussion that carries on here and is important to push. Again, I find it very difficult. And again, I'm the anthropologist running away from things, but I find it very difficult, to tell people to be vegan in that context, because that is not, it's just not normal. It's a whole other way of being.
Yeah, my question was basically about the risk of the scaling up happening. Like, do you feel like that risk to mass production, mass consumption, overconsumption is palpable at this point in time?
It's palpable for me, but it's not palpable for them. Yeah, does that make sense? So so that's my point. I've come in, I've seen, again, the benefit of 20 years and suddenly going, and so again, that's why I find the shifting baseline thing really interesting. So I go in and remember it as being a forest, and again, me valuing that. And then seeing it like this and saying that's horrendous. But what's interesting is the people in it seem to like it, and indeed then start valorizing the landscape. And so again, the example I had of Oxapampa, which is up in the highlands. So that was originally colonized partly by Germans. There's a kind of German descendant town there, and they were the ones who really did big cattle and stuff. And now, again, that's a tourist site where you go and you see the German looking towns, and they have amazing cheese and sausages and all this kind of stuff. And that family, the picture is from some friends of mine who went there on holiday with their family and were like, look at this, it's an amazing landscape. And you're like, no, that's, a destroyed landscape. But so that's what's really interesting, is precisely how people, that shift in how they understand it. Yeah. And so that's the point. You need outsiders. And again, this is when I'm covering too many things, but like decolonizing, the idea of working with local people. Well, what happens if local people don't see what's happening? No, that you need someone from outside going, no, you destroyed the forest. Yeah. And so that's my point. So for me, yes, it's like sound the alarm. This is important. But on the ground, there's very few people who think like that.
Thank you. 3 rows back, gentlemen in the glasses.
Yeah, thank you for your honest account of daily life, which is also a bit depressing, of course. Your point about sustainable development, I find a bit difficult, because without any sustainable development goal and without any Parque Natural, the road would have been built likely earlier and bigger, and etc. So what is the impact of that Parque Natural, that conservation area, in practice? Because in your talk, it's like the people really don't consider it a serious thing, well, my experience, I also worked for decades in Latin America, is that people are aware of the contradictions and they handle the contradictions and they make choices which me perhaps don't want to make, but they are not ignorant of the contradictions. So what are the internal struggles and discussions and decisions made by Alcira which limit the devastating ecological damage?
So, I mean, what's interesting with Alcira is that partly it's been protected because of where it is. So because it's between two rivers, because it's really steep hillsides and stuff, it has a kind of natural topographical protection. So it's kind of the low-hanging fruit, and kind of Peru's done this, I would argue, in certain cases, where, you know, some of the Parque Natural and some of the Reserva Comunales are in the areas that have kind of been naturally protected anyway. So that the pressure hasn't been on it that much, you know, because people couldn't get in and all the rest of it. So again, part of my argument is that Alcira need to change now because now there are the pressures, yeah? And so I think I would argue that yes, they've been aware of the contradictions. Yes, there's a kind of discussion about economic and social, but because the park has been naturally protected, they haven't been as important, yeah? And again, this is just one case study, but there's other areas of Peru, other reservas comunales, other protected areas where these issues are worse, where there are much more land invasions, people taking stuff out, gold mining. They haven't been protected as much as possible. Yeah, so I don't want to totally rag on Alcira, that they're trying to do the right thing. They only have a few park guards, they don't have that much work, but to me, there's a fundamental, but again, what I'm trying to argue is that it's not just on them, that it's on a broader narrative we have about sustainable development, that we're all kind of part of that, and that allows for these kind of things to happen. So it's not saying that it's trying not to single them out, although that's the nature of anthropology, because that's where I've done the research, but it's saying that they are representative of a broader framing, which I think is problematic. And again, then saying that, like the SDGs should exist, and yes, and then we can have all the arguments about SDGs and the rest of it. But again, I'm just trying to make a simple point, which is we need, I don't know, even, but if we're thinking about for the future, what kind of goals there would be, my argument would be you need to prioritize the environment in certain cases and not think about it as equal. You need to prioritize the environment, and whether you do that on a global scale or whether you just say, well, in particular places that's the case. So those are my kind of arguments.
Let's go online again. There's a question from Alex Shankland, which includes some indigenous place names that I'm going to
say. Hi, Alex.
He says, thanks, Evan, really interesting. The Ashaninka of Apuexta on the Brazilian side, the Acre-Ucayali border, have been putting a lot of effort into engaging with their fellow Ashaninka on the Peruvian side around alternatives to logging and ranching, based on quite an essential narrative about Ashaninka cosmovision. Yeah. Had the communities with which you've been working around Iparia heard of this initiative? And if so, what did they think of it?
Hello, Alex. So Alex is here at IDS, and he works with Ashaninka people on the Brazilian side, so on the Acre, in Acre on the Brazilian side. And there's a super interesting group who he's talking about there, led by a family who originally, their grandfather or whatever came from Peru, all to do with Sendero Luminoso and all the rest of it. And they've set up this amazing reserve, and they've kind of, there's so much to go into. But to specifically answer your question, Alex, so the people I work with are not in contact with those people. For my other project, which was further upriver on the Atalaya, I met someone and we precisely had this conversation. He'd been there, and we had exactly that conversation about how amazing that group is in Brazil and how they managed to get funding, and they've done these incredible environmental work. And we precisely talked about the need to connect them to people in Peru. And I'm precisely thinking about applying for money to make that happen. So yes, so Alex, perfect. I will contact you and we can have a discussion and that's part of my thing, of my final point about education, which is it's precisely what you need, is to connect up where it has worked and where indigenous people have gone forward. And again, the differences between Peru and Brazil are quite important there as well. There's kind of a lot of complexity in that. But Alex, yeah, I've exactly had that idea and I should talk to you and we should have that discussion.
Alex has very helpfully corrected my pronunciation as the place in Brazil is Apiucha, according to his phonetic writing, just so in case anybody is aware of that. Let's Joe in the room again.
Even great stuff, as usual. So if you want to make a link then between these contradictory or competitive concepts of economic development and conservation, have you ever thought of bringing in the idea of ecosystem services, which is pretty much why we invented it 20 or 30 years ago, in order to make that bridge, to convince folks that are interested in all the things that economic development brings, but to show how conserving nature would also lead to economic benefits.
But is that thinking about payments for ecosystem services?
I'm saying in general, concept, just to make that equivalency, because you do have, it's not unusual in development to have those competitive concepts, right?
Yep.
And the second, and I have a second question that I'm curious about. So you were saying that this is a conservation area, and yet you're also pointing out how folks that live there find the landscape, the grazing landscape, grassland, to be beautiful and part of it. By the way, there's this idea of cultural landscapes, right? In Central Europe, where they're fighting to conserve those cultural landscapes. Yep. So we even have a precedent in Europe. But how do folks there reconcile the idea of conserving, it being a conservation area, and they're smart people, so with conserving species, conserving water quality. The water quality must be crap there now after the grazing, right? So how do they reconcile that idea with the idea that the grazing areas are sustainable?
Yeah, so I'll take the first one first, which is, I mean, part of my thing is that they don't. I mean, that's the thing, that, again, this idea of conservation, essentially they feel imposed upon. And again, this is what I find really hard, because I don't want to say that these indigenous people here want to destroy everything, but equally, they are slowly destroying everything. And so again, talking to people in other areas where this has happened and then the forest is gone, people, then they say, oh, the water's completely destroyed. Oh, there's all this. At the moment, you can still, the quebradas, the streams are still running smooth. There's enough forest behind. And again, I mean, this is an interesting thing about the fact of El Sira being there, which is because that is still untouched, partly because it's protected, but I would argue more because of the topographical protection. That means that people are like, well, we still got that, so we can do that. So there's a kind of complex reality. And again, this is my argument about the need for education, which is to take people to places where it's totally deforested and it's all cattle, and then say, look, this is what happens. So yeah, so I think that's my first one about, again, the reality is it's slowly creeping and people don't fully recognize the implications of it. And then the first question of ecosystem services, I mean, that's, again, local people don't think about it in those terms. So there is an argument to, teach people about that. And again, that becomes part of the thing of, you don't realize that if you cut all the forest down, that the rivers are going to get bad, like making those connections that, again, people are kind of aware of, but really trying to bring that out a bit. And again, I mean, this is the work of, like the work in Ecuador we were doing with Mika is, I see as kind of further along, precisely along that path. And then you try and work with indigenous or with local people, teaching them kind of scientific methods alongside local understandings and kind of bring that together. But I see that very much as, the teaching going both ways. and that you need to do that. And then in terms of ecosystem services for payments, the danger there is so again, I basically that's what Programa Bosque is. And the key thing there is that just needs much more funding in a way that it is an economic, the calculus changes, that the money is there to support ecosystem services and to support forests, that it makes economic sense for people. So that's there. And then if we go into kind of red and things, carbon credit payments, that's a whole other argument, which I will leave for the time being. And I'm not in favor of carbon credits for lots of reasons, but there should, money needs to come in to pay for ecosystem services from outside. And I think, again, part of the education, part of the dialogue with local people has to be, okay, these are the things you value. You do value having monkeys and animals in the forest and the fish, and we need to have a conversation about. And that's what I find interesting about El Cid, because they don't really have those conversations in quite such obvious ways. And that would be, again, in my long-term goals, is doing the work that like Mika does in Ecuador and bringing that to Peru. And again, having those dialogues between outsiders and local people. In those kind of terms.
Thank you. Woman in white, and then we'll come back to this.
I understand your point of the narrative of, because they are poor, we are as the state, they are like promoting different measures to develop the region, and I think that's why actually this had happened. So I'm curious about if you have any thoughts or if you know what they think about what could be like a different way of development for them that is not specifically economically, if you can share that.
Yes, I mean, then what's interesting, again, and I've just been thinking about this literally today, like finalizing my arguments and my thoughts around it. But, then what's interesting, and that's why I was playing around with the three circles. I'm skeptical of everything, but I'm skeptical of the no growth, degrowth in kind of our concept in Western society, just thinking how big a change that is. But again, and this goes back to Alex Shanklin's thing about Benki, and so the Ashaninga group in Acre, is valorizing living in the forest, valorizing what they have in the communities, and trying to valorize that. I talked about Sunapoki, again, valorizing indigenous identities and forest identities and forest communities. And so again, it's thinking about it that's kind of what needs to happen, that again, too many of the youth, and again, this is a classic thing around the world, want to go to Pucallpa, want to get jobs, want to have mobile phones like everyone else, and want all those things. And that's a reality, but then it's trying to say, okay, can we valorize the life here? So that, and again, it's a bigger aspect, but to me, it's having that conversation about, the benefits of being there. And again, the danger of that, which I always have, is, of romanticizing living in the forest. And again, so someone I met, anyway, someone who works for an NGO and was there, and then he was like, God, it's so hard in the forest. And so he's a North American, and it always strikes me how people never spend time in the jungle. And it is hard, and all the bugs and stuff, but it's all, but some people do love it and some people do make it. So again, I don't want to over romanticize it, but it's trying to valorize kind of life there in some ways. And again, the benefits beyond purely, because if we're only measuring it in economic terms, then it does just become about getting out as many resources as you can.
Thank you. Did you have a question? You had your hand up earlier. Yeah, sorry. And this to the front row in the hat, brown hat. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing your research. Really interesting. So I was really interested in the part of the lecture where you were talking about how like the road that is being built goes through the natural reserve. And to be honest, I thought the lecture was going to take a different turn at that point. It was going to turn into a real conflict between the Conservation Management Committee and the the local community, and instead you showed pictures of everybody giving thumbs up and hands on each other. Like that was, maybe this is just my, I'm from the US, maybe it's just my American bias, but when I think of, a natural park or a conservation area being established, you think of everybody who lives there being forcibly moved out. You think of guards protecting those areas and nobody being there, like essentially like a man-made natural area being artificially
so fortress
protected,
conservation,
the Anthropocene and all that. Yeah. So I'm like, where does this political will to be collaborative with the local community come from in this? Like you mentioned that there's like this project management committee. Like, is that like lack of bureaucratic capacity from the state of Peru to not, be so enforcing, or is that like a genuine desire to meet the community's needs? Just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, so I mean, I said at the start, I didn't spend enough time on it, but that's, I believe that, Peru's laws with its indigenous people have been incredibly progressive in comparison with most of the world. Mackay's about to ask a question. He's a Peruvian. He can tell me whether I'm right or not. But on paper, they've been very good. They were some of the first to give indigenous lands. The law of comunidades nativas is from 1976. So again, I think there's a genuineness to that. And then the idea of the communal reserve is a really positive one, but precisely this co-management. And again, my role as the development critic is to then think about, okay, this is great on paper, but how's it playing out on the ground? And precisely, and again, what's interesting is, because part of me worries that then the argument leads back to fortress conservation and saying, well, let's just get everyone out of the area and let's just protect it as it is. But not wanting to go to that and saying this is good, but thinking how can it be better? Yeah, I think that's a key thing. And again, like this is a space to think critically and to engage, but it's trying to think. And again, I very much tried to come up with ways forward, positive things to take from it and to go forward. Yeah, so that's where I am. Can we pass to Mackay who was asking that? Sorry, I put you on the spot now. You have to ask a question.
Because I maybe talked too much in your classes in the last term. Well, thanks, Evan, again for your present all your research and part of your life, I guess. So, well, I was wondering how we deal with this. I think globally we know that we need to conserve the world, the forest, land, blah, 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 which I agree with that. But how we deal with the genuine aspiration of this community to access to what we know and they know as a modern world. Because if we see the map, and that's happening in many forest land and also in the Andean region, there are a lot of communities which are basically isolated. So if you want to move from that community to Pucallpa, it's like hours or maybe days, and they see Pucallpa as a big city. So I want to go there, like access to the resources, to health, such a basic thing like health. So a road is like, okay, this is the minimum that we ask. And if we disclose this conservation area, which I believe they think that this is important, how we deal with this, And so it's more like a question, but also it's my thinking about this. We as people who live in city, we feel that, okay, what should we, because we are really connected to the world. I'm as a limeño, I'm really connected to really connected to the world, but these people not. So they really wants to do this. How we deal as a policymaker, as a researcher, as like just changing our mind. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean that comes down to the core of it really, which is that indigenous. So I was in Barranco in Lima on Saturday having ceviche with a Matseis man. Sorry, Mackay, that's a terrible thing to say. I was in 30-degree heat in the sun eating ceviche. Sorry, for a Peruvian, that's like the worst thing I could tell him when he's here in the cold. But anyway, with a Matseis man, so the Matseis live even further out than from like in northern Peru, way out. And we were having a conversation precisely about roads. And he was like, these gringos come in and they tell us we shouldn't have roads and stuff. I want a road. How are we going to survive without it? And, so absolutely. That's there. And yeah, I don't have any simple answers, but again, it's trying to say, I don't know, that desire is there, and trying to, So again, the other example, again, other project I'm working on is in the Purus. So the Purus is another part which is just by Acre, where Alex Shanklin works. And the Purus River runs out of Peru into Brazil. So anyway, that group is, the people who live there, there's no way for them to get to Pucallpa. You can only fly to Pucallpa, which is, they're still in that state or whatever it's called. And they wanted a road, but WWF went in and put in another communal reserve and a national park, the Parque Nacional Alto Purus. And people there, and again, our project there has been about the fact that they don't like that, and the fact that they do feel isolated, and they, feel that this park, and there it's a communal reserve, but then a park, and it's actually the national park, which is then no one's allowed in and is much more fortress conservation. So yeah, there's real push against that. But then again, I see that if there was a road, that would be terrible. So again, then it's it's these bigger trade-offs. And then that talks to the broader global thing of saying, well, if you want this protected, you need to pay for it. Someone needs to be looking at it and seeing it in that bigger thing and saying, okay, the trade-off is you can't have a road, but we will subsidize airfares, or we will find some ways of supporting you. And again, Castillo, the president, before he, anyway, Peru, me encanta Peru, pero tiene sus problemas, yeah. He was then promising precisely that. So again, I guess it's trying to find other ways of supporting indigenous aspirations that don't involve cutting roads and don't involve doing that. But again, it's about then finding other ways of supporting them and other ways, which again becomes about money, and it doesn't work. And then we're back to a broader problem. And again, then the example of Ecuador with Yasuni, trying to protect Yasuni and not getting money for that. But in an ideal world, it's finding ways of supporting indigenous aspirations while helping to support the environment. And again, finding some good examples and then trying to copy those.
Great, thank you. There's 2 more questions online that we'll take now, and then maybe one more round if anybody has any questions in the room. But firstly, from Amy Riley Powell, great talk, thank you. The point you made about indigenous communities and assumed natural harmony with nature is really interesting. And I was wondering how the communities feel about the receding forest, the lack of bushmeat, and assuming the increased reliance on processed food with the road access. I worked on the interoceanic highway in Peru, and the sadness at the loss of the forest was always outweighed by what was perceived as positive elements of the road.
Well, yes, that's exactly the trade-off. So again, this is the specificity of El Sierra is that there's still some gain because it goes up into the mountains behind. So there's a kind of a natural reservoir of animals. So again, it's interesting that they kind of get protected from the worst environmental outcomes precisely because they have that. But again, that just talks to the thing that's come up, which is precisely saying, showing local people this is what happens when that happens. And that was, Penny Harvey's book is about precisely that, and that work. And again, the experience on the Interoceanico, on other roads up in the highlands and stuff has been of that regret. So again, I think all you can do is try and show people that those outcomes. Yeah.
But she's saying there isn't regret, I think.
Well, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? That then they saying, well, we still like the fact that we've got quicker access down the forest. So, yeah, I don't know. And that's interesting where people saying, well, when we've lost it, that's terrible. But if even in that case, they think, well, the calculus was still the right one. Yeah.
And last question from online from Kim Martin. How do the communities you worked with view the notion that the West, as the industrial nations responsible for CO2 emissions, should be paying them to protect the forest? Is this debate present?
So so specifically around carbon and stuff, where I am in this place is not, that dialogue doesn't come in, but there is the broader argument of, which I'm told all the time, you destroyed your forests, now you come and tell us we can't do anything with ours. That is absolutely a narrative that's there. and who are Western environmentalists to tell us what to do? This is our forest. That is absolutely there. And again, that's the whole thing of having these careful conversations and dialogues and trying to say, okay, we do that. And then this talks to the broader thing of climate justice and the broader global discussions about who pays for what and the Western countries taking responsibility for that, which doesn't happen. So yeah,
the big debates. Any other questions in the room? Yes. Are there any others after this? We're just about to run out of time, so I will group them if. Great, go ahead.
No, it's more than a question, it's a reflection. I'm also from Peru, living in Lima, and it's also a thing of trust about the people. Right now, for example, in the Congress, Peruvian Congress, they are debating modification of a specific article regarding the national law of forest. And this specific article mentioned that which authority has the lead to administrate carbon markets. So in the news and everything, we're saying they are changing because they want to fund the incomes from that, and so the local people is not having that income, the real income. So I think that if I will be also a local community and I hear that and I'm conserving my area and I'm not receiving the thing, so why is the effort, right? So I think it's also a trust issue.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And there was a slide which I realized I switched over, which was precisely someone, so a guy called Toshiba is his nickname, saying, so they're meant to have, if every community is meant to have a comité de vigilancia, so a vigilance committee, where they're meant to kind of be park guards for them, and they're meant to go out and do it, but they're not paid for that. And and he's like, the state did this, this is the state that has imposed this, and they're not paying me anything. Why the hell would I do that? And then even further, so again, one of my friends is on EcoCira, and they don't get paid for being on the EcoCira, which is the co-management bit from the native communities. They don't get paid for that, and they're very aware that the Senam people get paid and get pretty nice salaries and live in, but they live in Pucallpa, and all their expenses are paid for and stuff. So they're very aware of that, and that's just kind of at the national level from the government. But then when you start putting in carbon markets, and again, the fact is, and again, we can talk about it, but as I understand it, the Peruvian government is basically, with the red, is trying to get it that it comes to the government, and then it's up to them how they disperse it. And that it would be much better if it was, money comes to the ground and then some of it went up the other way. So absolutely about trust and the power dynamics, the economics of it all. Very important.
Great, thank you very much indeed. I think just before we thank Evan again, a reminder particularly to those of you online, I guess, that the recording of this is available. The link is in the chat. If anybody here happens to want that, it's obviously available and you can ask for it. And we're closed for the next 2 weeks as a university. So this is the last one, certainly for a little while.
Isn't it 3 weeks?
Maybe 3 weeks.
Someone told me it was 3 weeks. I'm completely all over the place after being in Peru. So.
Anyway, in week 11, there may be, does anyone happen to know if there is a Sussex Development Lecture in week 11?
There's one on the 26th of April.
Great, that would be week 11.
Yes. The Ordering Practices and Solidarities, Universities of Century.
Oh yes, with Linda Morris and others. Thanks, so that's the next one to look out for. Thanks very much in the room. Thanks for joining us online, everybody, and thank you to Evan.